Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and today I don't have with me my co-host Michelle, but I do have our producer Jimmy here in the studio with me. So hi Jimmy.
Hi Steph.
Jimmy has been dragooned into this podcast because this is the podcast that I have waited my whole life to do, and that's because today we're talking about Anne of Green Gables. So I feel like all of my years on Earth basically have prepared me for this moment. So Jimmy, why don't you throw me a bone here. Let me talk about Anne of Green Gables.
Well, let's begin with the obvious question, which is why do you love Anne of Green Gables so much?
Well, so I started reading the Anne of Green Gables books as a child. I think I must have been about 9, possibly a little bit earlier. I can't really remember, although I do have my first copy of Anne of Green Gables, which is the most precious thing that I own. I can't actually articulate that, though. I just took to them as a child. They were exactly the right book for me as a child because I was shy, I was bookish, I was quite sentimental in my own way, and I just absolutely devoured all of the Anne books. There are 8. I read them all. I went on to read every book that Montgomery has ever written. I am actually more of an Emily Bird-Starr fan than an Anne Shirley fan. This is Montgomery deep cut for all of the kindred spirits and all of those people from the race that knows Joseph. Haha! Another Montgomery deep cut. So my heart belongs to Emily Bird-Starr from the Emily books, but I loved them. I loved everything about them. I was a huge Anne Shirley fan too. I loved the characters. I loved the stories. I found them endlessly rereadable. I think I read the Anne books once a year until, quite recently. Everything about them just worked for me, and I can't actually put my finger on why. And I feel like those books belong to me, and I think they're the reason why I do what I do.
Do you think they often have this reputation for being rather girly books.
Yeah.
Do you find them that they are sort of girly books?
Well, I have 2 answers to that. One of which is yes, they are. They are in that they're about girls. They centre girls' experiences. They centre the experiences of women. They often, or always really, except for a few exceptions, about the domestic, about family life, negotiating the domestic. So they are girlish books in that they always have kind of female protagonists. There's only one Montgomery book that I can think of, apart from a few short stories, that don't have a female protagonist. So yes, on the one hand, they are quite girly. On the other hand, I don't think they have to be girly. I don't think that they have to be only for a female readership. I think that any young child can relate to the kinds of things that Montgomery wrote about. So she's not always, but mostly she's writing about orphans. She's writing about lonely children. She's writing about children that might have had a kind of difficult upbringing, who might have been struggling with certain things, who feel like they're alone, and who are different. So the thing about Anne and a lot of her protagonists is that they're different. They're not the same as the people around them. They have different kind of expectations of the world, different interests. Anne is very bookish and sensitive and romantic, whereas she grows up in a very sort of prosaic world. And the other girls around her don't really understand where she's coming from. And so any child, I think, who feels a little bit like a fish out of water, or who feels like that the people around them aren't quite on the same level, or aren't interested in the same things that they are, which was very much me. I felt like I was the only one. I certainly was the only one who was reading as much as I was. So I kind of felt like Anne spoke to me for that reason. And so therefore I think that it's unfair to kind of relegate them to girls' books, because they speak to so many kind of children's and young people's experiences.
Now, I have to confess I haven't read any of the Anne of Green Gables books.
For shame, Jimmy.
I know, for shame. But one of the reasons I did agree to be roped into this particular podcast is that I am a self-proclaimed expert on the 80s adaptation of Anne of Green Gables, because I used to watch it religiously as a child. And by religiously, I don't mean every time it was on television, because, we're talking back in the 80s and 90s now, showing my age, unfortunately. Back in the day where, you didn't have easy access to any show you want to via the internet, where you had to wait until they broadcast it on television, or if, like me, if you really love something, you would go and buy the VHS I don't even know whether our readers would even remember what a VHS is, but you might know from 13 Reasons Why.
Yeah, that's right.
Reasons. So I started off with borrowing a copy of it from the local library.
Yeah.
And I watched it, and I was so surprised at how much I enjoyed it that I then devoured the sequel. So they did Anne of Green Gables. Sullivan Productions did Anne of Green Gables, which was a 3-hour adaptation of the first book, and then they did a sequel, which I want to talk to you about in a little while, because I think you have some reservations about the sequel, which I think from memory adapts about 2 of the following books and sort of combine them together to look at the ongoing story. And then there was a terrible 90s later on adaptation called The Continuing Story, which I refused to watch because it went to territories I wasn't comfortable with, for the story anyway. But the first 2 I absolutely loved, the Anne of Green Gables and the sequel. And what you just said before really did resonate with me about the idea that because she's an outsider, she does speak to people who didn't feel as if they really belong. And while there wasn't any specific reason as to why I didn't feel I belong in a particular situation, I never really felt comfortable in social situation. So when I watched these series, I went, I actually did really responded very well to them. And subsequently then I bought the VHS and would watch them pretty much once a month, I think. So I was very, very familiar with the series and have a deep love of the series as well. What did you think of the 80s series?
Well, I did really enjoy the first one a lot in the when I watched it. I was always a bit of a book purist, so I did prefer the book, and I revisited the book in the way that you revisited the series. But I did enjoy it. I thought there were many things that were really, really great about it. The 2 things that kind of stand out with me, the performances by Colleen Dewhurst as Marilla.
Her.
She's fantastic. And Richard Farnsworth as Matthew, who I can't even really think about without getting a bit teary.
No. I think that was one of the most heartbreaking moments on television I've ever seen. Which probably should preface by saying that there's going to be massive spoilers for this, but as Steph pointed out earlier, this was written in
1908. You've had plenty of time to read it, so I'm not going to feel that I can't spoil it. I'm going to spoil it with wild abandon.
Yeah, and I think it was a devastating moment when Matthew dies.
Yeah,
I can't even say it now without
I know
that terrible scene, because I think by the stage that occurs, I think I was lulled into a false sense of security. I was thinking, this is such a beautiful, bright, shiny world. Nothing bad could possibly happen, especially not to such a beloved and gentle and beautiful character like Matthew, who was just nothing but good.
Yeah, he was the epitome of goodness.
Yeah, and he just adored her so much. And so his death was just so devastating on so many levels. And I think just that parting scene, I was thinking the 80 series getting emotional just thinking about it, really.
Yeah.
That last line that he says to her just sort of broke my heart.
Yeah.
He's, I never wanted a boy, I always wanted you from the start. And I was kind of like, oh, Matthew.
I know.
And then she said, oh, Matthew is when I went, oh, dear.
Yeah.
I'm repeating the characters.
But that's a great example of like why the series works for everybody, because, children want to be loved, children want to feel safe, children want to feel cherished for themselves, especially if they feel like they're, on the outside, or they're a bit different, or they're not fitting in. And that's such a pure moment of like acceptance and love and community and family.
Yeah, and it raises one of the major problems, I guess, that we don't really consider, or I certainly never considered when I think about the ideas of being an orphan, which is that you are effectively rejected, often over and over and over again. And to have someone tell you that actually from the start you were what they wanted, it's almost like this redemption of some sort, as if you finally found a place where you belong, and then have that character die. I mean, that was just such a terrible thing to do to a child, really.
Yeah, no, and it's quite hard. It's just as heartbreaking in the book as well.
Fortunately, we had Marilla.
Yeah, fortunately we have Marilla, and I absolutely really did love those performances in the 80s miniseries, and I did think that the first film in particular was very strong. It had a real, like, the characters felt very real to me. It was very beautifully shot. The thing that didn't work for me about the first one is how beautiful Megan Follows is. She's so beautiful, and so when you have characters telling Anne all the time, you're a skinny little redhead, you're like, are you serious? Like, you cannot look at Megan Follows and describe her as anything but absolutely beautiful. I mean, when Rachel Lynn calls her ugly, I'm like, is Rachel Lynn actually blind? Because the only way you could describe her as ugly is if you were blind. So she was a little bit too beautiful, but she did do a good job as Anne. But she just didn't you couldn't buy that she was anything but this ethereal beauty.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, when I watched it, I was just a child, so for me it was just everything was believable.
Yeah.
So if a character said this person wasn't beautiful, I just sort of went, okay, well, obviously they're not the standard of beauty. And then when later on in the series you started to see other characters seeing Anne as being much more beautiful, then I thought, well, maybe she has turned to the standard of beauty now, even though her looks hasn't really changed from the beginning to the end. But you kind of get that sense that she's growing up, and she's really. For me, it was like a ugly duckling story. She starts off, even though at the beginning she does start off as a swan. She's meant to end as a swan in a way, and she fitted that swan role rather well. I remember a review someone once wrote about Audrey Hepburn in Sabrina. Sabrina is meant to be the ugly duckling story, and this reviewer said, who on earth can possibly believe Audrey Hepburn as an ugly duckling? But if you can't believe her as an ugly duckling, she really shines as the swan. And I kind of felt the same way with Megan Fellers, that she did shine quite well as a swan, and that transformation was quite beautiful for me to observe, in a way, to see through the eyes of the other characters. That they're seeing more than just her looks. They're seeing, actually, she's got quite a beautiful personality, quite a beautiful soul. And
she's growing into a confidence and so forth. And I did think that, all of, I think, the secondary characters were done really well, and it's quite faithful to the book, which, me being a book purist, I really liked. It's just the sequels, wheels fell off for me.
Well, let's go to the sequels, because as I said, I did also love the sequel. Not the continuing story, but certainly the sequel.
I have to rant about the continuing story later, by the way. Okay, but let's get one thing at a time.
We'll give you some space to rant about the continuing story, but let's hear your rant first about the sequel.
Well, I didn't hate the sequel as much as I hate the continuing story, but it did go off book in ways that I didn't really enjoy that much, and I think that was to create drama around the Gilbert Blythe relationship, because it was pretty clear where the story was going, that she was going to end up with Gilbert, and that was clear in the first
well, he disappears for quite a long time.
He disappears, and then there's an attempt to kind of ram together kind of different elements of the later two books. But to me, I can understand why they didn't do a kind of strict Anne of Avonlea kind of adaptation, because the sequel to the book, Anne of Avonlea, is very much about her as a teacher, teaching these provincial classes, and I can see how that might have been a bit dull to kind of to produce as a film, especially in the 80s, when the idea of being a teacher of a classroom in which you've got everybody from a 5-year-old to a 15-year-old might have been a bit odd. But I just the ways that it went off book kind of didn't work for me. I felt that there was an unnecessary kind of drama around the Gilbert Blythe relationship, which plays out in a different way in the book, in Anne of the Island, the third book to the series. And it just, the ways that it went off book kind of irritated me in ways that, I'm not saying that I would not have accepted any changes, but I just didn't feel like the changes were organic to the story. They kind of just annoyed me. But I didn't hate it. I didn't ever feel the need. I think I've only seen it once or twice. And I didn't feel the need to kind of revisit it. I revisited the first 80s film quite a lot, but I didn't revisit that because it just wasn't my Anne. So my Anne spends, a year or 2 years or whatever it is, in Avonlea. Then she goes to college. She has all these adventures in college. Anne of the Island is, to me, the greatest college book that I've ever read. I mean, the way that Anne, she sets up, so in the books, she goes to college and she sets up house in this place called Patty's Place, with 3 of her friends, and they have all these madcap adventures and love affairs and all this. And I absolutely loved it. And it gave me these kind of really, really massively inaccurate ideas of what university life would be about. But it's just that I really liked the kind of adventures that they had, which are very different to what's represented in the sequel. So it's not something that I didn't feel like it was something inherent about, the performances or anything like that. It just went off book in ways that I didn't appreciate, and couldn't forgive.
Oh, I mean, there was one element of the sequel that I didn't enjoy so much, and I don't know whether, since I haven't read the book, so maybe you can illuminate on this particular issue. But there was a romance in the sequel between Anne and Captain Harris, I think his name was, who was the father of one of Anne's student, Emmeline Harris.
Yeah, no, that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And I didn't feel that relation... Well, at the time, we're talking about a 12-year-old me, mind you.
Yeah.
At the time, didn't feel that rang true for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't, maybe because he was so much older than her.
Yeah.
And back then, anyone older than 30 was ancient.
Yeah.
To you. So, back then I thought, oh, why would she want to marry some,
some
decrepit
old
old man?
Yeah.
And, really, he was only about 38, I think.
Yeah.
Which is quite depressing when I think about it now. But I didn't like that aspect of the relationship. But what I did like, and again, maybe these characters didn't actually appear in the books either, is Captain Harris's mother, who was played fantastically by the wonderful actress Wendy Hiller, I think her name is, who originated the role of Eliza Doolittle in the Pygmalion film.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she was just wonderful. I mean, I love stories about cantankerous old women who, actually have a softer side. And she just played that role so perfectly. And I loved the relationship between Anne and her, and also between Anne and her daughter, or Captain Harris's sister, whose name completely eludes me right now, who's also a spinster, shy, reclusive woman. And Anne sort of draws her out in the same way that she draws the daughter out as well.
Those characters as such don't appear in the books, but they're kind of amalgams of characters that are. So in Anne of Windy Willows, which is the 4th book, I told you I was an Anne expert, there is a character that's like that Anne draws out, who is a spinster character who is quite bitter about life, and who Anne kind of takes under her wing and shows her that there's a possibility for a better life out there. And there's plenty of cantankerous old women characters that I think are being rolled into that character.
Yeah.
But certainly that character doesn't exist, and that relationship doesn't exist, and that's the primary reason, I think, that relationship that I didn't like the sequel. Anne does have a kind of boyfriend in Anne of the Island. His name is Royal Gardner, which I always kind of thought was a bit lame, like, his name is Royal. Anyway, but she breaks up with him when he proposes, actually, which is kind of awkward.
Which is what Captain Harris does.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing it has been amalgamated.
Yeah, it has been amalgamated, but he's a very different character. He's not old. He's not a father. He's a university student that she knows, and he represents kind of Anne's romance expectations. She's got these expectations that this tall, dark, and handsome man will, sweep her off her feet.
Which is what Captain Harris represents.
Yeah, exactly.
In the series.
So they've changed it slightly, but kept that kind of romance spirit. But I didn't really know why he had to be like a father and so much older than her. It was a bit weird.
I think it was probably to draw in the Emmeline Harris and the cannot remember her name.
The sister,
the grandmother.
The grandmother.
And the grandmother.
Yeah.
Harris into that story as well, because I think possibly they wanted a role for Wendy Hiller to play.
Yeah.
And she did it so well that. So it sounds like from everything you've described, they have sort of amalgamated a whole bunch of different characters together to continue that story, but maybe not spread those characters out, because possibly for a mini-series there wasn't as much room to do that. Yeah,
they've kind of amalgamated 3 books into one. So that's Anne of Avonlea, Anne of the Island, and Anne of Windy Willows. So they've kind of wrapped a lot of storylines from those 3 books into one and kind of moved them around a bit.
And I think, the main reason I have to say, that I loved the sequel is because, at heart I am a romantic, and I loved the way that it ended. And that was sort of my reservation for the continuing story, because I thought, Anne of Green Gables, the sequel, ended on such a wonderful note. Her realization that, the one she loved the most was actually Gilbert. And has always been Gilbert. And he's been there by her side the entire time. And in fact, he proposed to her very early on in the sequel, and she rejected him. That happens
in the books too.
And then that realization that, the thing dearest to her was the thing that was always closest to her at the time, and she went looking for herself when really she should have just
turned around.
Turned around to see. And so I loved that idea, and I loved Gilbert from the first movie, so carrying that on through. And also a part of me wanted her to come back to Green Gables because I missed Marilla.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly kind of, I don't know, taking her away from Green Gables is always difficult.
Yes. And that was my reservation for moving on to the continuing story, which I refused to watch and still now refuse to watch. You, I believe, have massive rants about that.
I have massive rants about it. Okay, first of all, again, unnecessary complication in the story with Gilbert, right? So they try and make drama where there doesn't need to be drama. And secondly, again, this is part of like my book purist thing. So the last Anne book, Rilla of Ingleside, is, in my opinion, the best Anne book. It takes place during the First World War. In fact, it is the only Canadian book written about the home front in the First World War. So focusing on women's experiences of the First World War. It's obviously based on Montgomery's experiences. And her daughter, it's about her daughter, who is now, she starts the book at the age of 15. Her name is Rilla, Bertha Marilla Blythe. So she starts the book at 15 and ends the book at 19. So it's about her and her experiences. Anne is an older woman. She's in her late 40s, early 50s. And it's a beautiful book. It's sad, it's happy, it's wonderful. I really think, like, I actually experienced the First World War through that book. So, when it comes time to Remembrance Day, I'm like, oh, but the Blythes. And yeah, then I have to remind myself that they're fictional. So I didn't kind of, I mean, that book is so perfect that I would love to see that book adapted on its own. And so the moving of Anne into a First World War context didn't work for me. The way they tried to complicate and, make into a kind of soap opera her relationship with Gilbert, even though there's tensions in her relationship to Gilbert in the books that happen after their marriage. Anne of Ingleside has a kind of, the last section of that book is about her kind of worrying that Gilbert's fallen out of love with her. But the way that they kind of added the soap opera element to that, and I can't even remember what happens. There's all these, he's presumed dead, and she's on the battlefield, and she's a nurse, isn't she?
I think Cameron Daddo's in it, isn't he?
Yeah, Cameron Daddo's in it. Like, what? Really?
Wasn't he meant to be the sort of alternative love
the rival?
Yeah,
I'm like,
rival,
what is happening? Why is Cameron Daddo there? Anyway, and it's really odd. Actually, there is, what I find most disturbing. It's a deleted scene, but it still exists. You can look it up on YouTube. It's Anne of Green Gables, Anne Shirley, and Gilbert Blythe's first night as a married couple. So it's a sex scene. It's so wrong. It's not at all explicit. It's just like soft focus of them taking each other's clothes off, and I can't believe that I've seen it. And it's not. You don't even see any kind of nudity or anything like that. But just knowing that it exists makes me angry, because it's not a. Yeah, so wrong. It's not about that. It's, the romance is for young girls. They're not supposed to be like sexy sex.
Well, this is an interesting reaction, I think, from both of us. When you said that scene, I think we both just went, just sort of imagining.
Wrong.
But why is that an issue? I mean,
I know,
presumably two people getting married, they
yeah,
I'm sure
they have 6 children.
Obviously, they had sex more than once, obviously. But why is it so traumatic for us, do you think, to imagine Anne and Gilbert having sex?
I think it's because, they're so bound up in my childhood, and they're so bound up in this, like, innocent kind of, like, image of romance that wasn't about that. And I just kind of think that I didn't need to see it. Like, of all... I have no problems with sex scenes and things, but I have a problem with sex scenes in that. And it just didn't seem organic or real to the story. I mean, I don't even have, like, a problem with kind of more gritty kind of, as we'll talk about when we come to the new adaptation, I don't have a problem with a particular scene from the new adaptation, which I hope we'll get to talk about. But it did bother me. And I just felt like that they tried to stretch out the Gilbert drama, because they'd already gotten engaged at the end of Anne and the sequel. It was like they had to kind of go back and complicate things so that we were hanging out for the resolution again. And I'm like, but there's already been a resolution. And I think Rilla of Ingleside shows that there was other stories that you could tell that are related to Anne but not about Anne. And it's such a brilliant book. It's really a wonderful book that and you can read and appreciate it even if you don't, it's a standalone really. You don't have to know Anne of Green Gables particularly. So it kind of just annoyed me that they ruined all of that and didn't focus on Rilla. And I mean, Ken Ford, who is kind of Rilla's love interest in Rilla of Ingleside, is just the ultimate romantic hero, really. I mean, he should be, like, in a museum, I think. Yeah.
I think they try to rectify that whole issue you're talking about by having a spin-off series, which I didn't really get into, called Road to Avonlea.
Yeah.
Did you ever watch any of those?
The Road to Avonlea is based on 2 other books of Montgomery's, which are called The Story Girl and The Chronicle. No, The Story Girl and oh god, I can't remember.
No,
The Golden Road. It came to me.
It's bad to say.
Yeah, no, I did like that. They actually, those books weren't set in Avonlea. They changed them to being set in Avonlea so they could kind of capitalise on the Anne connection. But they were 2 totally standalone novels. The Story Girl was the first. The Golden Road, which is about the same kids, is the second. I did really like that. And what that series did, I haven't seen the whole series because it was hard to get in Australia.
Yeah, it was.
But what that series did is it actually dramatised a lot of Montgomery short stories.
Okay.
So there's 2 Avonlea-related short story collections, which are called Chronicles of Avonlea and Further Chronicles of Avonlea. And the stories are kind of... And so the series Chronicles of Avonlea is a sort of mix of those 2 short story collections plus The Story Girl and The Golden Road. And so it gives you an opportunity to adapt more of Montgomery short stories. So I quite enjoyed that, but I haven't seen all of them. And I did absolutely adore the actress who played Sarah Stanley, who was the Story Girl in The Story Girl. So yeah, I thought that was lovely.
Okay. Now I was actually hoping it would be more of a spin-off, looking at some of the characters whose story I never kind of got to understand because the series wasn't interested in their stories. So characters like what was her name? Miss Stacy, Anne's first great teacher.
Yeah.
Because I always thought it was such a shame that we never hear from Miss Stacy again after after she leaves Avonlea. And I thought, well, what happened to her character? She was such an inspiration for Anne and sort of changed her life so much.
Don't worry, they stay in touch.
They stay in touch. It's
all good.
Maybe because we're teachers now, so we
like to think we gravitate towards the teacher characters. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So let's move on then to the grittier
Anne
version, which is the new Netflix series Anne with an E. What did you think of that one?
Well, I was totally petrified. Sorry, I can't speak. Petrified to watch it because I'm such a, as you have known now that I've been talking for half an hour about this, such a book purist and so kind of fussy about it. And I had read that it was a grittier Anne and that it was about kind of excavating the kind of darker parts of the book. So I came in prepared to not like it, and I actually did like it a lot, except when we got to the last episode, which we will talk about. I really enjoyed a lot of elements of it. There were some elements that annoyed me, but I really liked... I really actually appreciated that it did try to bring out that darkness, because what people overlook about Anne of Green Gables, because it's such a sentimental novel, and because it's, children's literature, beloved children's literature, people kind of don't notice the fact that it's about a girl who's been orphaned as a baby, who had never had any kind of love, affection, or care in her life, who has been farmed out, really, to a bunch of women with a lot of children who treat her as an indentured slave, really.
And beat her, I believe.
And who are violent towards her and who use her to take care of their children when she's nothing but a child herself. And she's had periods with 2 different women, and then she's ended up, intermittently back in and out of an orphanage. So she's had an awful life. Anne comes to Green Gables having no experience of any kind of parental care or affection, any kind of love in her life. The only kind of emotional solace she's had is her imagination. So there is a lot of darkness and grit to Anne of Green Gables, but the thing is, it's there before the action starts. And the reverberations are felt through the entire book if you're a careful reader. So I actually did appreciate that it played up those elements, which the series hinted towards, the 80s series hinted towards, but didn't kind of get to as much. Yeah,
I mean, the 80s series definitely, I think, did made suggestions in the form of Anne's objection to working. There was one scene I can think of in particular, as I said, I've watched the series so many times, where she, after Marilla takes her back, she's about to be given to another local woman, Mrs. Blewett.
Mrs. Blewett, yes.
Who has 2 sets of twins or something like that, and just they're looking horrified. Twins have hurt a lot in life, I think she says.
Yeah.
Because she's just absolutely horrified by this idea of having to look after so many children, and she mentioned, I think, to Marilla after Marilla sort of says, well, actually, you know what, I don't know whether I want to give her up yet. I should talk to Matthew first, and I think that was a moment I sort of fell in love with Marilla, because I thought, here she is, this rather cold-hearted woman, and then suddenly you see that there's actually depth and complexity to her, that she's not willing to sacrifice this girl she doesn't know to a life that she knows is probably a lot worse than the girl deserves. But yeah, and then Anne explains to her that she looked after so many twins that she's had a lot of traumatic experiences from looking after twins, and that's suggested in the '80s series. But in the recent Netflix adaptation, there's some wonderful visual devices they've used, almost to suggest her. It's almost like PTSD or something.
Yeah.
Like that. She actually just freezes in the moment, and she's lost in some of these memories, some of the trauma that has happened to her, and I think that was one of the moments where it occurs, where she just sort of had a flashback to a rather ironic, almost twistedly funny, but at the same traumatizing scene where her adopted or her foster father was beating her, and then dies of a heart attack while beating her.
Yeah.
And they're going, okay, well that's either poetic justice or some form of strange comedy. But but that also added to her trauma.
Yeah.
Added to her guilt that she
was responsible.
Yeah, she was responsible for his death because she was there being beaten by him when he died, and that was also shown in the '80s as the opening scene where the widow actually blames Anne and says, this is nothing but your fault. You did this.
Yeah.
As it's just, you did this because you were there for my husband to beat. So
yeah, that's right.
I know,
yeah.
it was such a cruel and terrible world, and I think I like the Netflix series for actually showing that darker side, which was always implied but never really shown. So you really actually got to see and experience possibly what it might have been like to have been an orphan in that particular period.
Yeah, and there are a lot of scenes that are kind of not explicitly represented that way in the book, but are clearly like the kinds of things that would happen to a poor orphan girl who is used as a form of cheap labor, and that are fleshed out a lot more in Anne with an E. So I really that didn't bother me. The darkness of the series didn't bother me. I didn't feel that it was taking Anne in a direction that it wasn't already. I just felt like they were bringing to light things that were there in the book that weren't necessarily as present in the '80s series. And I think that that's really true to life of Montgomery. Like I said before, many of Montgomery's books are about poor orphans, isolated children. I mean, the Emily books that I referred to before, which is a trilogy of books, they start with Emily losing her beloved father. So she's her mother has died in childbirth and or very soon afterwards, and Emily's father dies in like the first chapter of Emily of New Moon. So they're always about isolated children, suffering children, abused children, and what Anne with an E does is bring that to the forefront. There were things that I also liked in Anne with an E that weren't necessarily in the books, which I thought I wasn't going to, but I did. One of them is actually Anne getting her first period.
Oh.
I know. I would have thought that, like, if you had told me beforehand that they were going to have that in the series, I would have said, "My God, that's so wrong." But it actually, like, the way
I suppose it makes sense.
The way it played out was so kind of real to a girl of that age and in that time, and her complete kind of confusion and her feeling that, oh my God, I'm dying, or what is happening to me? Like, I can't account for this in any way. And also, it's the kind of thing that Montgomery couldn't write about.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, there's no way she could have put that in a book. But it just played out so real to me. And I really loved the actress. I don't actually know her name. It escapes me. But I really loved the actress they got to play Anne. I'm not saying that she's an ugly child. I'm not saying that at all. But when Mrs. Lynde says to her, you're freckled, you're thin, you're ugly, she is those things. She is very thin. She's very freckly. She looks more like a real human child than...
She does.
Yeah.
She's a wonderful actress.
She is a wonderful actress.
But I think, at the same time, there is actually potential there for her to... I don't know what she actually looks like in real life, because I've only ever seen the first episode, mind you.
Yeah.
But I almost feel a sense as if they've... the creators are messing around with us a little bit.
Yeah, how so?
I think, the actress is probably a lot more attractive.
Yeah, probably.
than what they're showing her to be. I think they're sort of, making her up to look a little bit more drab than what she is, so that when the transformation does happen for her, it'll be a little bit more believable.
Yeah,
I
well,
guess.
she is very she looks the way Anne is described in those early sections of the book. She's very thin. She's very pale. She's very freckly. She's dressed unattractively. She does look like a real human girl. Like, she doesn't have the kind of ethereal beauty of the Anne of the '80s series. And so you can see, like, when Mrs. Lynn comes in and critiques her appearance, you can see why that would be both something that somebody would say to her, and also how devastating it would be. I think she's a really great actress. I think she captures Anne perfectly. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and she pointed out that when Anne has a moment of happiness, the actress who plays Anne, her face lights up in this way that is very kind of expressive, and she does look transformed in the way that Anne's emotions play out on her face in the book. So she is very well done. And as much as I loved Matthew and Marilla of the '80s series, I do really also love the Matthew and Marilla of the new series. I thought they were really well done. I thought that Marilla in particular was really well done. She's got that kind of buttoned down kind of strictness, but also the sense of humour of Marilla.
Yeah.
Which is a really endearing thing about Marilla, is a sense of humour.
And there's a warmth to Marilla that's hidden, very, very much hidden underneath all that layer of sort of stiff coldness. And Marilla was actually always one of my favourite characters, because she's one of those characters who, the more you get to know, or the more you understand the character, the more beautiful as a character she appears to be, because she is really quite a complex and fascinating, but very generous character in so many ways. But she's also, she has her flaws, and I think that's what I love about Marilla. Matthew I adore, but he was too good to be true.
Matthew is just the embodiment of goodness.
Yeah, he's so good. He's so nice that I thought, it's very rare that you'll meet anybody like Matthew, but Marilla is somebody I could sort of see in our world, and I love Marilla for that particular reason. Now, you mentioned you had issues with the last episode.
So I had issues that are earlier as well. So my issues from earlier in the season is I didn't like, in maybe the second or third episode, I can't remember which, there's a scene in the book where Anne loses Marilla's amethyst brooch, and they play that out in Anne with an E as well. But in this case, Marilla is so incensed by what she considers... She
sends her off.
She sends her away. She sends her back to the orphanage. And I didn't buy Marilla acting like that, because by that time Marilla and Anne have already bonded. And it makes Marilla look flighty, and it makes Marilla look mean in a way that Marilla's not mean. She's many things, but she's not mean.
No, and that's probably why I was very hesitant to watch the next episode, because it ended on that cliffhanger where Matthew's desperately riding to catch the train, but of course he misses the train, and she's been sent off to the orphanage. And I thought, this didn't happen in the '80s series. This is the purist in me, except I'm purist for the wrong reason. I'm purist for the '80s series instead of the novel.
That certainly doesn't happen in the novel.
And I thought, a part of me felt a little bit betrayed by that story, because it maligned Marilla's character in a way that I didn't feel was true to her character. She, I think, even if she did go through with it, at some stage she probably would have changed her mind. So, I don't think she would have sent her back to such a cruel environment, especially not after she has started to quite like this girl.
Well, that's the point of the Mrs. Blewett anecdote, where she goes to see, and that happens in the book, and with Anne with an E as well, where she says, "I wouldn't give a dog to that Blewett woman." So she understands fully what she's sending her back to. So yes, that annoyed me about the recent series, that section. And then the next episode became like an adventure narrative of like getting Anne back, and Matthew kind of on his horse, kind of, and getting on the boat across to the mainland, and all of this sort of stuff, which kind of alienated me. When they got back to Green Gables, things got better.
Okay.
And I really liked, actually, another thing I really liked about it is that they're really kind of good at, Anne with an E's good at kind of bringing to light all of these secondary characters. So, people like Ruby Gillis, Prissy Andrews, Jane Andrews, Moody Spurgeon, who is like this dorky friend of Gilbert's, who is the kind of most secondary of secondary characters, appears in Anne with an E. And I was like, wow, talk about another Montgomery deep cut. Here's Moody Spurgeon. And I really loved the way they did Josephine Barry. who becomes a kind of mentor to Anne. And later on in Anne with an E, we see her kind of grappling with the idea of romance versus career, which becomes a kind of theme in Anne, in the later Anne books. But to get back to another thing that I didn't like, which came up in the last episode, is that the last episode ended really weirdly for me, because, as happens in the book, Green Gables is threatened because there's been a banking crisis, and Matthew is sick and can't sustain Green Gables. And so in the book, that's the reason why Anne doesn't go to college straight away, but she goes into teaching.
Yes.
And she becomes a schoolmistress at the Avonlea School. In the series, they have her selling all their possessions. She goes to Carmody, sells all their possessions. There's this weird kind of theft narrative. And then there's these two these two robbers that rob her of a bunch of things, end up being boarders at Green Gables at the end. And like there's this kind of, and she opens the door and there's these two kind of robbers, thieves there, and they're about to kind of move into Green Gables, and they kind of leer at her, and I'm like, where is this going? Like, I don't understand what they're doing with that. And there's a suggestion that those two are going to be like the primary antagonists of like presumably what will be the next season. So it's like, I don't understand what that is. So I didn't really at all understand where that was going. There's a kind of complication with the Gilbert stuff that isn't in the book, but I didn't mind, that happens in the last episode, in which Gilbert's father dies, which happens in the book but not quite at the same time. So I just didn't know where they were going with it at the end. I felt like I could cope with most of the differences from the book up until that point. I was just that kind of thieves showing up at Green Gables, and they're going to kind of, I don't know, be troublesome tenants of Green Gables. That just struck me as random and not in a good way. So that kind of annoyed me. But up until then, I really enjoyed the series. Actually, I watched it, as I think I told you, in like one weekend, and just kept like pressing next episode, because it was lovely to just be back with those characters. Like I just loved and like I said, hanging out with Dana Barry and Ruby Gillis, and it was nice. It's a happy place, and the scene in which Diana and her get drunk on the raspberry cordial, it's just worth its weight in gold every time.
Do you think the reason for the ending of the first season occurs as a result of this sort of cliffhanger generation that we're living in? Everything has to end on a cliffhanger to draw you into the second season, so sort of leave suggestion, possibly Game of Thrones can be blamed for that. For ending on such a violent or implied violent note that we immediately want to know what happens next. But interestingly enough, it has the opposite effect on you, where you're thinking, well, I don't know if I want to watch the second season now, because where's this going? Where's it taking me?
Yeah, I do think that they give into that, and I think that storyline at the beginning of the series with Marilla sending her back is another kind of manifestation of that, like that cliffhanger, like we've got to give people a reason to keep watching. Whereas I feel like the thing with Anne of Green Gables is that there's no real, I mean, there's moments of tension, but there are no cliffhangers. But the reason you go back is because you love the characters and you want to know what happens next. Yeah. And so by having such a dramatic kind of, in my view, ridiculous cliffhanger, it kind of sold out the story in ways that really annoyed me.
Yeah, I suppose that's why I loved the 80s adaptation so much, because it ended on such for me a beautiful note. Not the sequel to the first one, which you do agree on.
Yeah.
In that it ended on that lovely note that Gilbert actually gave up his post. At the Avonlea School, and says, you can take this, and I'll take
White Sands.
And that was sort of the moment that Anne really looked at Gilbert and thought, he's somebody. He's really somebody. And it was a lovely way to end that particular series, and made me really want to watch the next series, because I thought, oh great, I get to see what happens to them next now. It's not a cliffhanger idea where it's like, oh, now what's going to happen?
No drama.
drama.
Thieves in Green Gables.
Anyway, I love the idea of a text can be self-contained without leading on to another text, but still make you want to read the next one. And that's exactly what he did for me. It was kind of like, well, now I get to find out what else happens to Anne and Gilbert and Marilla and all those characters.
Well, that's exactly what the books did, and that's why you keep moving through 6 or through 8 of them. Some people say that there are only 6 Anne books, because the two later ones are about her children's generation, but I count them. So yeah, that's exactly what the books do. They don't leave you with any cliffhangers. They wrap up their plots, but they keep you going because you want to encounter those characters again. And so I feel like there's unnecessary kind of dramatic kind of escalation in the way that it ends. But I think there are many things to recommend Anne with an E still. I just think that perhaps it's trying a bit too hard at times to be gritty. I mean, there's some parts where I feel like it really benefits. Like they really flesh out Jerry, who is the hired boy that the
Yes, I thought that was
take
quite
out.
interesting because I don't remember him from the 80s series at all, and suddenly here's this little boy who had a French Canadian accent.
Yeah, he's French Canadian. Yeah.
And I thought, who's this character? And then when his name came out, I was like, why do I know that name? I think he's mentioned a few times in the 80s series, but we never actually got to see him in the 80s series. And here he is as an actual boy who's just trying to do his job.
Yeah, and he actually becomes a huge character in, especially the last two episodes. And he's certainly in the book, but again, he's sidelined in the book because he's a servant. He's of the servant class, and it's actually quite interesting to think about like the politics of class in Montgomery's books, because she's very much on the side of the poor and the dispossessed, but then she has like French characters as like the lower classes, like the French Canadian characters are like the lowest of the low, and they're only for servants, and you don't kind of associate with them. So I think they're trying to remedy the kind of class politics, the problematics of the class politics, by bringing Jerry more to the front in the series. And I quite enjoyed that. I liked the little boy that played Jerry. I thought he was quite funny, and I liked that idea that Anne does have a kind of child of comparable age in the house, and of course they're going to chat and talk about how annoying things are or whatever. So that's going to be that's kind of felt to me a nice addition, not a annoying addition. So there were lots of things that they added that didn't bother me at all, and that was one of them.
Well, maybe the second series will hopefully redeem or solve some of those issues that they had issues with. Can we talk a little bit about Montgomery as an author and what you know of her? Because I know very little actually about Montgomery.
Well, Montgomery had a really sad life actually. So a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, her family actually revealed she committed suicide, which had not been known.
Oh wow.
So she left a suicide note, but it was suppressed by the family. And I mean, she's got living descendants. She died in 1942. So that's not, it wasn't 100 years ago. So she's got, a lot of family that's still around who remember her. So she had quite a happy childhood, I suppose. Her parents, her mother died, but her father was alive but didn't live with her. She lived with her grandparents, and she ended up being a carer for her grandmother, who was a very strict woman. I think she was Marilla without the humanity. I think she was a much stricter...
Fantastic way of describing her.
Yeah, I think she was very much a Marilla character, but without the softness of Marilla. And so she cared for her grandmother for years and years. She got married quite late for the times. She had 2 children, 2 boys. She was unhappily married. Her husband was quite mentally ill. She moved on marriage off Prince Edward Island and went to live in Nova Scotia. Her husband was a parson, so she was a parson's wife, and she had a lot of responsibilities that took her away from writing. And so she was quite an unhappy woman, and she actually grew to really hate Anne, which is sad.
As a lot of authors tend to do when they spend so much time with a particular character. I mean, Conan Doyle's specialty certainly did. He hated it. For his entire life, he hated Sherlock and really resented this character that he had created, almost like this monster that he had created. But the public loved him so much, and so I'm guessing Montgomery would have felt the same way. The public loved Anne so much. And in fact, I came across a rather interesting little bit of trivia because I was looking, before this podcast, I was looking up Anne of Green Gables because I was thinking I would like to revisit the 80s series again. And I thought, I need to buy it on Blu-ray because everything's on Blu-ray for me. And I can find the first one, but I cannot find the sequel anywhere except in Japan.
Yeah, Anne is huge in Japan.
Anne is huge in Japan. The Japanese absolutely adored her. They've got the complete this beautiful box set of the 80 series, which has the entire Anne of Green Gables film or miniseries, and there's also an anime series of I think the entire Anne series as well.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and they absolutely adore her. And I'm thinking, what is it about the story that just really resonate?
She's always been big in Japan. There is some scholarship out there on Anne fans and the Anne fandom in Japan. I think it's like a cultural nostalgia, even though like it's a setting that's far away from Japan and is very culturally different. But I think that there is a nostalgia for that kind of time. So Anne is set in like the late 19th century up until the last books are set. The last book finishes in 1918. So it's the turn of the 20th century. There's a kind of nostalgia and love of that kind of bucolic environment of Prince Edward Island. It's a very beautiful place. It kind of harkens back to a simpler time. So I think there's a lot of cultural nostalgia that's going on there, as well as that kind of, like I was saying before when we were talking about whether they're girly, that those kind of like growing up, development, child isolation.
Which a lot of Japanese respond quite well to.
Yeah.
They always felt, I remember reading somewhere once about the Japanese population being a rather introverted society. And people say, well, they're very surprised to find that out because, when you think about Japanese, you think about Japanese youth who have, blue hair,
wild hair and
clothes and are so out there and everything. And somebody pointed out, yes, but that's the youth. Yeah. That's the rebellious youth of that culture. When they become adults, they're no longer like that. That only occurs in a very short period when they really feel as if they don't belong to that society. So they start acting out in ways that are in complete opposition to that society. So I suppose a character like Anne would speak quite well to people like that who felt they were very much outside of that society.
And remember, Anne does try to dye her hair.
She does. Green. She goes green.
She doesn't intend
No, she doesn't intend to be green.
Yeah. She does end up with green hair. Temporarily, of course. Yeah.
And then she, of course, cuts her hair.
And then it goes a real pretty auburn.
Well, we're coming close to the end, but I just wanted to ask one final question to test your love of this particular series. Who is your favourite character, or what is your favourite moment in this entire series?
In the Anne series specifically?
In the Anne series specifically, yes.
My favourite character is the daughter Rilla from Rilla of Ingleside. I think she's a wonderful character. She's got, she's a bit different from Anne. She's less bookish. She's a little bit kind of more, she starts off, Rilla of Ingleside as being very flighty. She's very vain. She's very beautiful. And she is a flirt. And she really enjoys that kind of flirting, dancing, etc. So she's quite different from Anne, but her experiences during the war really mature her. It's another story of a girl maturing. Okay, so it returns to that kind of paradigm from the original Anne of Green Gables. And her story is so beautiful, and she's such a wonderful character, and she's funny, and she's smart, and she's resourceful. I absolutely adore Rilla. And my favourite moment in the series, oh god, this is a really hard one. Any scene with Miss Cornelia Bryant. So she is this, I told you I'm going really full deep Montgomery here. So Miss Cornelia is a secondary character who first turns up in Anne's House of Dreams, which is the 5th book in the series, which is a book in which Anne and Gilbert get married and have their first 2 children. And she's another cantankerous old lady.
Oh, I love cantankerous old lady.
I know, you would love Miss Cornelia. She's a Presbyterian. She absolutely hates Methodists, and she spends most of the... and I didn't even know when I was a child growing up. I was like, what's the difference between a Methodist and a Presbyterian? I didn't even know there were 2 things. She absolutely hates Methodists. She spends most of her time talking about how much she hates men and how much she hates Methodists. So she spends most of her time kind of complaining. And also making things. She's always sewing and all of this, and she's so funny. And just any moment in which she's in the scene is a cracking, really fun scene. And there's this one beautiful scene at the beginning of Rilla of Ingleside, where Anne has just returned from an overseas... No, sorry, this is the beginning of Rainbow Valley, which is the 7th book. Anne has just returned from an overseas trip, and Miss Cornelia is like catching her up with all of the gossip from the town. They live in a town called Glen St. Mary at that time. And it's just this hilarious scene which he goes and talks, like, not meanly, but talks gossip about, like, literally everybody in the entire town. And it's so funny, and yet it gets so much exposition across. It's such a beautiful device. And it's just, I love her, and any scene she appears in is going to be a great scene. So I'm going for some really deep Montgomery cuts there.
Yeah, you're showing yourself as a
true Montgomery expert. I'm truly of the race that knows Joseph, and that's a Miss Cornelia thing. So I think that's all we have time for today. If I don't get stopped, I may be here until next week. Thank you, Jimmy, for talking to me about Anne of Green Gables.
Been an absolute pleasure.
We miss you, Michelle, again.
Come back soon.
Come back soon. I know, I'm bullying Jimmy so badly.
She is.
All right, this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. Again, I will ask you to please rate and review us on iTunes. It really helps other people to find the show. Any feedback or suggestions for future episodes would be great. You can drop us a line at our website, which is fromthelighthouse.org, or through Twitter at MQEnglish, etc. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. I promise not to talk about Anne of Green Gables. Bye!